This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards from Scott Ellsworth, the author of The Groundbreaking, which was longlisted for the National Book Award, comes a riveting new account of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. His latest is a page-turning, eye-opening account of the last desperate months of the Civil War when the very future of the U.S. teetered on the brink amidst ideological clashes and political extremism. But more than that, Midnight on the Potomac, the last year of the Civil War, the Lincoln Assassination, and the Rebirth of America, is an incredibly timely read. For 1864 to 1865 was hallmarked by many sentiments the United States faces today: political upheaval, competing truths, and a nation trying to move forward in an age of extreme division. Scott Ellsworth is the New York Times bestselling author of The Secret Game, winner of the 2016 Penn ESPN Award for literary sports writing. He has written about American history for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times. Formerly a historian at the Smithsonian Institution, he is also the author of The World Beneath Their Feet and Death in a Promised Land, his groundbreaking account of the 1921 Tulsa race massacre. Scott lives in Ann Arbor, where he teaches in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. Go Blue. Welcome, Scott Ellsworth, to Speaking of Writers podcast.
Thank you, Steve. It's a real honor to be on your podcast.
Thank you for being here. So why this book for you, and why this time period?
So, some books have a moment when you just know you discover something, you open a document or something, say, that's it. That's what I want to write. This one took a while to do. And it really came about through kind of three different routes. One was I was very concerned about, I've never seen our country so divided politically and even culturally and socially, everything else. These last few years, certainly in my lifetime, I was a kid during, the late 60s and early 70s, but this is much worse and much more fundamental. So in thinking about it, I thought we're really the only time we had been this pitted against each other was really during the 1850s and 1860s during the Civil War. So that was very much in the back of my mind. And then it kind of came through a little bit of an odd route. My wonderful literary agent, David Larabelle, when I was looking about for a new book a few years ago, he said, well, have you ever thought about true crime? And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And I had read some of the classics, In Cold Blood. I knew it quite well. The Executioner's Song. And I read about 13 true crime books, which was more than enough, believe me. And I looked into a couple of episodes. I thought maybe I could tell a larger story about the 20th century or whatnot. And then they sort of ran out, and I was thinking of kind of the crime of the century. And for some reason, I thought, well, what was the crime of the century for the 19th century? And it was the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. There was no question about that, at least for the United States. So that got me thinking as well, too. And the Civil War has been a part of my life since I was a little kid. Um, I grew up during the sort of the centennial of it and collected the stamps, all of those things. I attended Robert E. Lee Elementary School, where I was a shortstop for the Lee Generals Little League team. That was a part of things, and I'd sort of paid attention to it. And then I started kind of looking around the war and looking at this last year, the war and other things, and I just became astonished by some of these stories that had never really been put together, and by some new information. And it took a while to put it together, and eventually we figured it out, and here we are.
You laid out the book in three acts. Why?
Well, I mean, that was a little bit of a nod to John Wilkes Booth, of course, who
Mm.
was an actor, and wanted to figure out a way to have some divisions. But the first act of the book is really what first astonished me, which is how close we really came to losing the United States as we know it today. I mean, we were very, very close to having either the Confederacy survive as an independent nation, or having slavery, go on and survive in the United States until who knows when. So that was sort of the first shocking act that I ran into. We tend to think about, certain, you learn history through stories and also through benchmarks. So we think about the high tide of the Confederacy at Gettysburg, and that, at that point everything was all, set, the North was going to win. That wasn't true at all. And in the spring of 1864, there were these tremendous battles at the Wilderness in Spotsylvania that have largely been swept under the rug, but taken together as one, that was the largest battle of the Civil War. And it was not one that either the North or the South won. The casualties were absolutely horrific. And both of those battles have largely been forgotten as well, too. So that was the beginning of a process of me looking very carefully at this period and trying to have a better understanding as to what was going on.
Midnight on the Potomac also shatters some long held myths. I want to come back to Booth. You mentioned Booth and the Lincoln assassination. So he was not working alone.
Well, no, he was not working alone. But the other thing is, we've really gotten Booth all wrong.
Hmm.
Sort of the image that we all grew up with and exists today is that Booth was this second-rate actor who was living in the shadow of his much more famous father and brother, that he was somewhat mentally disturbed and things like that, but he was able to gather this ragtag band of friends to try to do things. But that wasn't Booth at all. Booth was a superstar of the American stage. He sold out venue after venue. Hundreds would be turned away in Boston, in New York, and Chicago whenever he performed. Theater owners would, sell all the seats, sell all the standing room, and one theater owner was going to put hooks at the back of the theater so people could hang on it and get a sense of him. People would clap for 5 minutes when he was done. His acting was this incredible physical style that the whole entire audiences would stand on their feet to watch him. So he was this incredible rock star. But as one of his friends, an actress by the name of Clara Morris, said, he couldn't have organized anything.
Hmm.
This was somebody who was really a pawn in someone else's game. And while we don't have a single smoking, gun by any means, Booth was connected to a number of people who were members of the Confederate Secret Service, and there's little doubt but that he is doing things at the behest of others.
Yeah, and he was only 25 feet away from Lincoln at the second inaugural too, and then talks about how he had a shot there.
Exactly. No, absolutely. No, he was 26 years old. He was very handsome. He was a great personable people. Women fell in love with him, but men liked him as well too. And but this image of this sort of disturbed loner is really not his story at all.
And not only do you focus on the big names like Booth and Grant and Sherman, but also some of the lesser known folks here, like an intrepid female war correspondent, Lois Adams. Who was Lois Adams?
Lois Adams was one of the great journalists that nobody knows about. She was from Michigan. She was a farmer's wife. Her husband died. She had to make a living and raise kids. And she started writing for Detroit newspapers and then became the Washington correspondent for newspapers in Detroit. But she was just a brilliant, thoughtful, insightful writer. She wrote beautifully. And she really was one of those types of people who could kind of cut through all the fluff and get to the heart of the matter. I mean, she saw what was going on. She recognized big events for what they were and how the nation was changing. But I was just, enthralled with her and stumbling upon her. And, just to add to that, Steve, a lot of this stuff, things that I've relied on, these were done by amateurs, people who were Lincoln buffs, who were Civil War buffs. Lois Adams was discovered by a librarian at Central Michigan University and put together her works. The work on Booth was done by a gentleman named Arthur Liu, who was a computer expert for an insurance company, who on weekends decided, I'm going to find out every newspaper clipping about John Wilkes Booth and figure out exactly where he was. And it just overturned everything.
Hmm.
And, valuable sources from amateurs out there who are doing the work.
So, amateur is part of your research. What else was part of your research process for this book?
Well, one of the processes, which I was really lucky at, is, here at the University of Michigan, we have the second largest university library in America. I could hit it with a baseball from my window. And the staff there is absolutely fascinating, fabulous. And if they don't have it, which they normally did, that they would get it for you. So during the writing of this book, at any one time, I probably had 95 or 100 books, a lot of regimental histories, diaries, and memoirs by Civil War soldiers and others. But everything was just right there and available. And then I, did research elsewhere as well too, and went to the primary sites in the book. But a lot of it was based on kind of old-fashioned library research and libraries and archives.
Scott, how close did a rebel general come to capturing Washington?
Jubal Early became very, very close. He marched an army that the Union really didn't know anything about all the way down the Shenandoah Valley and did it in secret. Not only did his army, it go down the valley and invade Maryland, defeating a Union or smaller Union group at the Battle of Monocacy, but they actually entered the District of Columbia. And a number of his subordinate officers were ready just to move ahead, and they were within an hour horse ride or less of the Capitol, of the White House, thinking that they could burn those, maybe they could capture members of the Supreme Court or even President Lincoln. So we became very, very close, but for reasons we don't really understand, Jubal Early blinked, and he waited a day, and that's the day that helped save the Capitol from being burned a second time after the British did back during the War of 1812.
Scott, as you went through all of the research, give me a couple other surprises for you.
Well, I think part of the surprise is one thing I wanted to do is, we all have this vision of Lincoln as, the great emancipator or da 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 and all that. I really wanted to look at Lincoln as more as kind of a regular human being, just describe his physical ailments, look at him as a family man. And I think in doing so, I started to have a slightly different view. I didn't really push too much on it of Mary Todd Lincoln. I mean, she's shown as this shrill, very surface individual, but she carried a lot of burdens. And then their youngest child, Tad, had always been sort of shown to be this brat, but as it turns out, he's really this charming young man who could befriend any animal. He lived with his own menagerie, and he was very, very important to President Lincoln. So, when Lincoln died, not only did the loyal citizens of the country lose their great leader, but a couple of children lost their father as well, and a wife lost their husband.
Scott, when readers finish the last page of this book, what would you like them to take away from it?
Well, I think I like them to take away, history is something that is best told by telling a good story, and hopefully I've told a good story because the material was there. But I also want Americans to know that we owe a lot to the debt of this incredible coalition of loyal Americans, men and women, black and white, immigrants and native-born citizens. They didn't always agree on things, but together they joined together and they saved our nation in this hour of need. And they helped really create the new America we live in. Now, we're in a time of crisis as well, too, but I want people to remember that we've been through terrible storms in the past, and God willing, we will get through this one as well.
How'd you become a writer?
That's a really great question. I've never took a literature class. I've never been to a writers conference. I've never done any of that. I think there were books in my life at a young age. I think and probably like you and many others, I listened to a whole lot of rock and roll lyrics and growing up on top 40 radio, thinking about that. And then when I was an undergraduate, I was encouraged to, turn my senior thesis into my first book, which has been in print for a long time now. And it just sort of added one after another.
What's the best thing about being an author?
Well, I think the best thing about being an author is that if you're able to survive, you can have control over your life and your destiny. I think it makes you look at the world in different ways, and it's a way to communicate the human experience to others as well.
What would you be doing if you weren't an author? I know you're a professor.
Yeah, boy, I don't have any clue. I've done a little work in film, which I've really enjoyed
Hmm.
doing that. Done little tads of journalism here and there. Probably something along those lines. I just don't know. I mean, if I could play the piano, I'd play the piano.
And Scott, what is next for you in your writing?
That's the $64,000 question. Right now, we're trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out, and of course, I work with my agent and my editor, wonderful agent editor. But we're trying to figure out that next book. So, if any of you readers, listeners out there have some good ideas, just track down Scott Ellsworth at the University of Michigan. I'm all ears.
Yeah, and you can connect with him on the socials too. Instagram at Scott E. Author, Facebook Scott Ellsworth Author, and on X too at Scott E. Author. Midnight on the Potomac, the last year of the Civil War, the Lincoln Assassination, and the Rebirth of America. It'll be out on July 15th. The author is Scott Ellsworth. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Steve.
And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. Thanks for watching. I'm Steve Richards.